Dear colleagues, it's 1 p.m. in Moscow. Let me launch the first session of the Club of Economic Policy of the Higher School of Economics. And without further ado and long introductory statements, but I think we'll need some short introductory statements. The matter is why the club. My question goes to the initiator, Martin Gilman, professor of HSE, the person who has worked for 25 years at IMF, who worked in OECD for 6 years before he came to work at HSE, who is well aware and does understand the problems of implementation of economic theories. Martin?
Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, Юрий. Я рад возможности быть с вами и несколько слов сказать в начале. Частью идеи этого клуба это как раз мое преподавание в ВШЭ, поскольку вот что меня волнует. Даже на магистерском уровне студенты с хорошей теоретической подготовкой не очень хорошо понимают, как эти идеи притворять в жизнь, в практику. Поэтому интересная идея, как бы эту трудную задачу поставить. Идея клуба вот, расширить эту идею в мире, где теория часто не так легко применить в довольно хаотической практике. ЛПР, как я понял, работая в МФ, и часто решают эту трудную задачу, которая перед ними стоит, пытаясь объяснить, какой должна быть теория для практического применения. Вот современный пример. И потом я Илке дам возможность рассказать о своем опыте. Сейчас идет дискуссия в отношении политики ФРС по поводу инфляции в Европе и США. Это временное явление или нет? У нас много экономических теорий есть, и практику очень сложно толковать, интерпретировать, и результат этого анализа является критически важным для решения в отношении экономической политики на перспективу. И для вас, Юрий, для коллег, как раз задача посмотреть, может быть, эту вот проблему поставить на нашем заседании сегодняшнем и на последующих заседаниях клуба. Большое спасибо.
Мартин, спасибо большое.
Martin, thank you very much.
В нашем сегодняшнем заседании еще принять участие научный руководитель Высшей школы экономики Ярослав Иванович
Kuzminov. Ярослав Кузьминов want to take part. He will get connected a bit later. Now I will ask Dr. Prostakov, Deputy Rector of HSE, and answer this question: why HSE supported the initiative of having this club? Thank you very much, Yuri. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm happy to see you all and welcome our overseas attendees. I cannot see, unfortunately, the entire screen. I see Marek Dombrovsky, I see others, and happy to welcome you. Probably it's the first reason why the HSE actually has launched the project. It's a platform for communication and context which is lacking, although we are very much in online, but the gap and the shortage of this communication is felt, and I hope that the club will develop looking forward in a more hybrid format and more participants will be able to participate offline. But most importantly, the club enables us to maintain our contacts, to expand our contacts with the international contact. Without this, without a constant exchange of opinions, I don't think it's possible to develop any university, any research center, particularly currently, where the HSE is not only an economics university, but a multidiscipline university, although it's an economic policy club. But since the views of the economy and the economics are changing, developing, I think this club will reflect this multidisciplinarity of the HSE, which is a fact of life. It's a new format for us and very promising indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great many thanks. And I believe that today and going forward, we'll be facing this question: why is there this gap between basic economic theory and economic policy practice? Why are there contradictions where policy makers make decisions against the economic theories? Perhaps before Iker speaks, if we could vote now on menti.com, use your smartphones, use your notebooks to go into menti.com site, log in the code, print the code, and vote. Please choose no more than 4 options of the answer. The results of the vote will be shown after Ilka's presentation. While you are voting, on the left, it's a code for Russian language voting. On the right is the code for English language voting. While we are voting, a few words about the rules. Now we'll hear Ilka Korkhanen's presentation within 20 to 25 minutes, then 10 minutes for Q&A, and 15 to 20 minutes for discussion. You can send your question through Zoom to the organizers electronically on the club's page, on policy HSE, on the portal of HSE. Now,
презентацию, и я хотел бы еще отметить, что у нас идет синхронный перевод.
We have simultaneous interpretation, and there's one language on each channel. In the Russian channel, we only speak Russian. On the English channel, we only speak English. A few words about the topic of the presentation and about the speaker. We are trying to invite speakers, people with academic background, but at the same time deeply immersed in practical matters of policy shaping. And I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ilka Korkhanen, a Finnish economist, heading the Institute for Countries in Transition of the Bank of England, a PhD from Helsinki School of Economics and Business Administration, a recognized expert in currency policies in countries in transition, monetary policy in countries in transition, and a few other areas. The topic of this, when maximization of welfare is not a goal of policy, why real policy measures are so different from economists' recommendations. Speaker, your floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'll bring up my slides, and hopefully you can see them now. Well, first of all, I would like to thank very much the organizers for this honor of inviting me to talk to this prestigious discussion club. I was very happy that this initiative came up. I haven't been able to travel to Moscow in almost 2 years, but now I've at least been able to sort of virtually visit Moscow, and hopefully very soon also in real life. So basically the question is why sometimes, why do we have a situation where economists, sort of well-meaning theories that often are supported by more than 90% of academic economists, why aren't those policy recommendations sometimes followed in practice? I will use two examples, two very different examples and two very different countries to illustrate some points. But I would be very happy to hear then the various viewpoints on how to actually achieve something that is more welfare enhancing. Well, first of all, in the title I'm talking about social planner, so let's remind ourselves what social planner in theories usually is. So quite often, still, I mean, after 100 years from Pareto onwards, we talk about social planner who is trying to achieve some form of welfare for the society as a whole. I'm here just taking a few pictures from ResearchGate net working paper archival site for the past 2 or 3 years, showing that in economic theory, the idea of benevolent social planner, welfare optimizing social planner, is very much alive. And we are still using this convenient fiction to think about economic policy. And I would say this is a very useful and convenient fiction, but it has its limitations when we go to the real world. So what usually happens, as you know, is that in a model, some simplified model of the economy, there is a welfare function for the society as a whole. It can be a function of real income, labor hours worked, whatever. And then there's a social planner who instigates policies as to maximize this social welfare subject to some restrictions. So this is in a nutshell what we are talking about. Now, quite often, then it so happens that what maximizes welfare in abstract models is not followed. That the policies are not followed in the real world. And the fields where this happened or doesn't happen, goes from foreign trade to research and development, production subsidies, consumption subsidies. There are many examples where in real life things get substantially more messy than in abstract models. And it doesn't matter. I mean, you can always say that pure dictatorship. The dictator doesn't care about the welfare of the people. He only seeks to maximize his own welfare, confiscates property, and so on. But actually, even in the most well-developed democracies, where presumably policies would reflect the preferences of the people, this quite often happens, that the countries are unable or unwilling to follow policies that would increase welfare. Now, it can be that there is a different understanding of the economy. Now, it's plausible that the different actors have different priors regarding say, parameters of different reaction functions. We are unsure how monetary policy affects inflation and inflation expectations in the short run, but especially in the long run. But it's perhaps not plausible that there would be a systematic difference between professional economists and then people who are actually making the policy. So I would suggest that in majority of the cases, the reasons for deviating from the first best policy, the welfare maximizing policy, they are different. They have to be different. And of course, there's a long literature on various reasons for this. I mean, decades long. Now, this literature basically started from trade liberalization or lack of it. And simplified, it just tells you that if there is a group in a society that benefits from the current policy, that this policy enables them to get economic rents, I mean, over and above what would happen in a competitive equilibrium, they have an incentive to lobby for the maintenance of this policy. Where, for example, in the case of trade liberalization, if you liberalize, if you lower taxes, tariffs, then the benefits for individual households usually are quite small. So that household, or even a collection of households, doesn't really have an incentive to use resources to lobby for that. Now, then, if rent seekers are able to block the changes, then they can regard the resources they spent in lobbying as money well spent. Now, a counter argument is that even if there are losers from the reform, say trade liberalization, in a sort of perfectly frictionless world, the winners of the reform could compensate the losers. So if the losers are now getting rents of say $100 per year, then presumably the benefits for the overall society are larger, and that perhaps tax revenue and tax expenditure can be used to compensate the losers. Often, as we actually will see in the second example, this is just not feasible. Either you cannot raise taxes, there is not enough expenditure, or then you don't know who the actual losers are. You cannot identify them either ex post ex ante or ex post. Then that makes reforms more difficult. And then I would also like to point out, having served as a civil servant for a long while, in all political systems, in all bureaucracies, there's a lot of institutional inertia. It requires effort and resources to change something. So to actually have a welfare increasing reform, you need people who will benefit one way or another, and who will have the resources and are willing to use the resources to try to argue for that reform. And it's in the real life, it's not always simple to find those kind of persons. Now, if you take politicians, for example, in most countries, politicians, for example, time. Politicians' time is very valuable. Now, they will think about how to use their time, perhaps to maximize their chances of re-election or something else. And sometimes then reforms that would increase overall welfare are just not worth their while. And that might mean that the reforms go, or there are no reforms for several years. Now, I will use two examples to try to illustrate some of the points, and I would very much sort of invite listeners to try to think of ways of how to break the deadlock in these situations. What kind of reforms, what kind of changes in incentives could be used to push through reforms? I mean, these are not simple, but these are real life examples of what can happen when sort of no second or third best sort of world persists for a long time. So the first example comes from the US. So more than 100 years ago, US Congress approved Merchant Marine Act, and its section 27 is called the Jones Act. So this came in the aftermath of the First World War, and the idea was to ensure that the US would have enough capability to build ships in case of military conflict. And you might guess that in many of the examples of similar kind, national security is often invoked as one of the explanations, or perhaps the explanation for persisting with suboptimal policies. But I would actually, at least in this case, argue that currently this act is undermining also US national security. So the Section 27 Jones Act, it deals with cabotage. So it means water transportation between US ports. And it states that all the goods that are transported between US ports must be carried on ships that are under US flag, that have been constructed in the US, and this is quite important, are owned by US citizens and crewed by US citizens or permanent residents. Now, in many ways, US economy still remains fairly liberal and free, but in this particular instance, this restriction is very, very tough. And World Economic Forum calls this world's most restrictive example of cabotage law. But in OECD rankings of sea transportation, China and Indonesia are actually even more stringent. But in any case, this is very, very strict. So what are the effects of this? Well, obviously, it's a subsidy for a protection for US shipyards. If US or any transportation between US ports must use ships that are actually constructed in the US, this is clearly a subsidy for US ports. As I said, this is presumably a question of national security. But when you look at the sort of specifics, for example, icebreakers, I mean, US used to have several. Currently, it has 2. And the, say, US Coast Guard and even Navy is constantly complaining that they don't have enough icebreakers. Why? Because the costs of actually building an icebreaker in the US would be very, very high. And as you can see, not an icebreaker has been built in more than 40 years. I don't know if the US shipyards currently would even have a know-how to build an icebreaker. As an aside, this is of course something that Finnish politicians always, when they visit the US, they like to tell how good our icebreakers and our shipyards are. Then, more effects. shipping costs for water transportation between US cities is actually much higher because of this. So the overall level of transportation is higher. This is basic, just economics 101. And there's a further twist to this that puts some of US citizens into much greater disadvantage. So the Jones Act also applies to Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, and Guam. So their trade with the rest of the US is much more expensive. And sometimes this creates just perverse incentives. Every time a hurricane hits Puerto Rico and there's a disaster and disaster relief is needed, it's actually much cheaper to ship it from other countries besides US, Mexico, some Latin American country. The shipping costs, for example, mean that when winters are cold, then in the northeast of US, where people use a lot of natural gas for warming, it's cheaper to ship liquefied natural gas, LNG, from Latin America or from Russia than from US ports on the Mexican Gulf. So it's hard to see how this enhances US national security. Now, as I said, this is a policy that is almost uniformly condemned by US economists. It means that the demand for water transportation is lower, which then, of course, has a knock-on effect on the demand for vessels. So currently, US has only 7 major shipyards, and of those, only actually 4 produce for military. So there are only 3 shipyards that are operating mostly on commercial basis, and these are now mostly producing inland water ships for inland water transportation. Furthermore, if the costs of transportation are higher, then the overall price level is higher. If the price of water transportation is higher, then the demand for other forms of transportation is higher, but then there are negative externalities. If there are more trucks on the roads, there's more congestion and so on. And as a result of all of this, in the US, only 2% of domestic freight travels by sea. Oh, sorry, it should be by water. Whereas in the EU, where cabotage is allowed for member states, so between member states and within member states, it's 40%. Now, there might be more rivers to navigate within continental Europe and so on, but still the difference is quite striking. And all of this happens basically for the direct benefit or slightly more than 100,000 people employed in shipbuilding. Of course, if you look at all these spillovers, the number would be larger. So this is less than 0.1% of total employment. But these people actually happen to be very much concentrated in the state of Virginia. So whenever somebody suggests that the Jones Act should be repealed, the senators and congressmen from this state are, of course, very much against this. And so far, they have been very successful in blocking all changes to the policy. So this is how Jones Act functions. And so far, as I said, it has been alive for more than 100 years. So it's I don't know if Senator Jones originally even envisaged that something like this could happen, but here we are. Now, the second example comes from a very different country, Iran. Iran obviously is a country very rich in fossil fuels. And for a long time, I mean, for almost 40 years, under the current regime, use of fuels, use of energy in general has been subsidized heavily. So natural gas, fuels, electricity, all are subsidized. Of course, fuels are subsidized in many energy producing countries, from Venezuela to Libya. Now, okay, this policy has results. For example, even though the cars are very much smaller, the consumption of fuel per car was second highest in Iran after the US. And of course, in the US, people drive big cars. In Iran, they drive small cars that are very energy efficient. There was and there is a lot of smuggling of the subsidized fuels. So if you are able to buy fuels at subsidized prices, and then you can smuggle them to Afghanistan or some other country and get close to market price, you will get a very nice profit from this. So instead of poverty alleviation, this is basically encouraging people to commit crimes. Now, there's a long literature in public finance about subsidies, targeted subsidies, and how they are a very inefficient way to alleviate poverty. Directed transfers would be much better. This is all very non-controversial. So there would be more poverty alleviation, there would be much less waste, less pollution, less smuggling if we could do away with the subsidies. And of course, Iranian policymakers were and are keenly aware of all of this. So in 2010, when they started a reform program to try to correct some of this, total of fuel and food subsidies were assessed to be roughly $100 billion US, or almost 1/4 of Iranian GDP. So this is a very significant number. And clearly, especially in the context of tightening international sanctions, something had to be done. So as I said, reform started in 2010. This was under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. If you remember him, sort of short guy with a beard, definitely not a liberal reformer, but in that case, the situation was so dire that something had to be done. So subsidies were cut slightly. Effect was completely as expected and predicted by theory. Prices went up and consumption went down. The upshot, or the sort of downside of this, was that the savings to public sector finances were not, at least not totally, used to increase social expenditure. And this was also because the Iranian government or the public sector basically lacked data on income. They didn't know who was poor and who was not. This led to demonstrations in many cities, and the reforms were partially halted in 2012. So as often happens, there were 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There were different modifications to the reforms in the following years, but the government basically did not dare to go sort of very much further in cutting the fuel subsidies. It felt that the popular backlash immediately following the price increases would be so large, and they could never credibly commit to raising social expenditure sort of later, so that basically they just stalled. And in 2016, the reform plan was officially abandoned. And so now we are in a situation where subsidies are somewhat smaller than they were, but there's clearly, there's still room to go. And this is one of the major inefficiencies of the Iranian economy. So Iranian economy is hobbled by sanctions. That is perfectly true. But I would contend that the internal inefficiencies are at least as big as part of the story as the sanctions. Then, of course, there was a political fallout that the President Hassan Rouhani, who followed Mahmoud, he was replaced by a more hardline President Ebrahim Raisi this year, partially because people were so angry about the increased fuel prices. So these are two fairly, I don't know how well known examples, but I would say typical examples of different non-optimal policies from the point of view of an economist who thinks about models and benign social planners and so on. In real world, it's often very hard, even if you can always say that, should just cut the subsidies immediately and the market will adjust. But sometimes the political reality is that there is not enough time to wait for the positive developments or effects coming from the reforms. So it's hard to achieve the first best or even the second best. And in the case of the Jones Act, inefficient policies can persist for a long time. I mean, if they are not large enough to really cause major problems like the Iranian subsidies, then economies can tolerate smaller inefficiencies for a long time. And different groups, say shipyards in the case of US and that Jones Act, are able to sort of accrue rents year in, year out. And then, of course, as I said, I mean, why should a politician who cares about his or her own chances of being re-elected, what are her incentives? I mean, why should this politician use political capital to change things? Now, if there's a clear crisis, as in Iran 10 years ago, it, of course, changes things. You have to do something. But in normal times, sort of muddling through is a very probable outcome. And political systems, for all political systems, favors that status quo. And I think normally this is a good thing. So I guess then the last question is that, and I hope that in Q&A people have opinions about this. What should economists do? I mean, we can say that the models would suggest that we should move into this direction, but then how can we be helpful in formulating real-world policies where we can actually buy, or we can get some winners who would advocate for further reforms in different areas? And this is tricky and sometimes messy and requires sort of intimate knowledge about countries, sectors, fiscal systems, and so on. But I'll stop here and shut off my slides, and looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Ика, большое спасибо за выступление.
Thank you so much for your very engaging presentation. We have already accumulated a number of questions that people sent in before and during your presentation. The first question is, it's very uncompromising and very straightforward, but our club is very informal and very open and honest. Why I'm calling it uncompromising? Who knows, in your opinion, how to increase public welfare, social welfare? Which version of the economic theory do you stick by?
Well, that's a very good question. I would contend that in most cases, if we are increasing real incomes of most people, and especially of those who are currently poorer, if we are improving health outcomes for people, if we are able to raise their life expectancy, and at the same time say environment is not getting worse, or even environment is improving in some sense, I would say that most people would agree that welfare has increased. Now then, of course, when we get into income distribution and so on, things become trickier. But on the sort of more overall level, I would contend that not too many people would disagree with that.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Ika, the next question is, in what countries does economic policy contradict in a great way to the economic policy in developed nations, lesser developed nations, transition countries? And what is the main reason this is happening? Is it the weakness of the theory for countries like this and arbitrary decisions of the politicians, or something else?
Again, the closer one looks, the more you can see countries, all countries, sort of diverging from first best. I would also say that the perhaps one measure of success. So perhaps you can turn the question around and say that many of the countries that are now rich became rich because they were able to at least get some of the policies right. They were able to reduce rent seeking in many sectors and so on. Some of the countries that are now growing rapidly have been able to do this because they have been sort of conducting reforms, at least in some sectors. China is a case in point. The reforms that were started 40 years ago started from a very low base, but when you start from a very low base and do some basic reforms, you can grow quite a bit. I don't think you need different policies or different theories for different countries, but you need, when applying theory to a particular country or particular sector, you need an in-depth knowledge about that sector and that country.
Спасибо. Коллеги, если у кого-то есть вопросы, у меня, потому что есть еще список из вопросов.
If anyone has further questions, I have a list of questions. You can send the question to me in chat, and I will give you the floor. Another question is, economic policy contradicts theory, sometimes because there are gaps in understanding how certain markets operate and where they're going, where they're evolving, which principles or recipes there are out there to mitigate such gaps.
Well, my immediate answer is that if I knew that, then there wouldn't be gaps, because I would know where to look. I guess then the second answer is that we have to be quite humble when we are thinking about how we apply our theories and knowledge, especially when we are thinking about areas and sectors that are new. Say, I have no idea how to regulate artificial intelligence, and this is an area where a lot of people are doing research, both in economics and in law and so on. But clearly, when something new happens, then we have to investigate and we have to invest resources in trying to formulate sort of reasonable policies.
Ика, громадное спасибо.
Thank you so much, Ika.
У нас еще здесь остались вопросы.
We have some other questions left here in the chat, but let us first take a look at what happened with the voting in Menti. I'm going to show you the results now. Some brief comments. Most representatives of our audience noted the following deviation between policy and theory is the influence of lobbyists or influence groups. The second reason is that theory doesn't catch up with real changes, and the third one is the influence of the population, of populism. And it seems to me that if we identify different influence groups and separate them out, it doesn't really determine this waveform-like movement between globalism and regionalism in trade. Because in every case there would be interested groups that are interested in protectionism, and there are even bigger groups sometimes that are interested in reducing barriers. Nevertheless, in policy, such biases are inevitable. And now I would be happy to give the floor to my colleagues for their discussion. Some of the colleagues have already asked for an opportunity to participate in this, and I would like to first give the floor for that to Martin Gilman. And again, please limit your speeches by 2 or 3 minutes.
Мартин, включите, пожалуйста, микрофон.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Ika, I have a question that I'd like to come back to because I found what you were saying was very convincing. When the economics profession among themselves are relatively unanimous, as the cases you cited, both the Iranian fuel subsidies and fuel subsidies in other countries, the Jones Act in the U.S., and similar type of restrictive practices. I think economists generally have a unified view. But what about a situation where, in the real world, where economists don't have even a solid area of agreement in the theory that would be applied? And this can be difficult. I mentioned in my very preliminary remark just about the current issue with the U.S. Federal Reserve System and whether inflation is a transitory phenomena or is it something else. I have to say personally, as an economist of a certain age, that I remember when Arthur Burns was the head of the Fed and the Fed economists and at the IMF and the World Bank were arguing that, well, there's so many structural changes taking place in the world economy in the 1970s that create bottlenecks, and those bottlenecks in production are having a temporary inflationary effect, as we found out somewhat later when Paul Volcker came in, that these effects had not been just temporary, but they were treated by much of the economics profession at the time as exception to the general tone of underlying inflation, which was considered to be more benign. And so how do we as economists, what is our reality check to make sure that we are not following some narrative within the profession that says, for instance, that inflation is temporary, or that that oil prices are spiking because of supply questions, and that will go back to a general deflationary type of situation. And these questions for policymakers become critical. So let me leave it at that. Maybe come back later. Thank you.
Спасибо. Я думаю, что это можно рассматривать на самом деле даже как комментарий, прежде всего, и коллеги в комментариях попробуют обсудить этот действительно вопрос, когда у нас нет какой-то одной теории, которую мы считаем исключительно правильной, и подходящей ко всем случаям, возникает естественный вопрос выбора.
applicable to any situation, and there is a matter of a question of choice. I've been told that Renaud Seligman was raising his hand, director and representative of the World Bank in the Russian Federation. Renaud, 2 or 3 minutes. Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy that you will have launched this initiative. It's wonderful. My comments will be in English.
I think that Ika really laid out the challenge, the problem that we're facing around the world very nicely. And in fact, in 2017, the World Bank came up with the World Development Report on exactly that question. It was called Governance Under Law. And the key thesis behind it was, why is it that bad policies persist and good ones don't get implemented? And that's perfectly illustrated by the energy subsidies discussion, but also by other policy areas such as education, where we know that teacher absenteeism leads to poor student learning and outcomes, and yet who will take on the teacher unions and actually address teacher absenteeism in a lot of countries where this is a big issue. So we have basically 4 points that are explained in this very long report, so I'll try to explain them extremely concisely, and so to excuse the brevity. One is that all of these policy decisions take place within a complex political and social context, which is called governance. What is it? It's individuals and groups with different interests and an equal power that are competing for their interests, for their conflicting interests, but they're also competing within changing rules, within the rules of the game, right? And the rules of the game themselves are subject to competition. And so that means that they are optimizing within constraints how they can push for their interests. So that's the first point. It's a game. There is a game of governance that underpins any policy area and any policy reform. Second point, within that game, what does the success of policies depend on? Well, we say that it depends on good governance, and we define that in 3 ways. One, the ability to have credible commitment over time. The example there is, credible commitment, say, to fight inflation. 2, it depends on good coordination between actors, and there the example or the counter-example would be bank runs, where you have poor coordination that leads to a suboptimal outcome. And 3, it depends on cooperation between people. And then a good example of something going really wrong in cooperation is the current situation on vaccines, where many countries have more vaccine doses than they can use, and the majority of countries around the world don't have enough to vaccinate even 10% of their population. So commitment, coordination, cooperation means functionally good governance, right? Then the third point is to say, well, when do these functions not work well? And we answer that by saying when there are power asymmetries that really interfere with these functions. What does that mean? One, exclusion. Some groups that don't get to participate in the process. What can that lead to? To violence. And the violence is very bad for credible commitment. Exclusion, number one. Number two, capture. When, for instance, the least productive firms get the most support from the government. Look at evidence of capture. Under Suharto in Indonesia, you could tell that the share prices of companies that were so corrupt and so connected to the government went down when Suharto got sick. So we can actually measure the level of capture of those firms by looking at their stock price. So capture is the second reason why these power asymmetries interfere with the good outcomes that Ikka described. And the third is clientelism. The example of teacher unions comes through there. So final point, what can be done about this? Well, what we say is that change is possible. You can change incentives through access to information, transparency, etc. You can influence preferences and beliefs, and just look at the way in which, for instance, the role of women in the economy has completely transformed over the last 100 years. That's a change in preferences and beliefs. And three, you can increase contestability, and you can change the roles of the three key actors, the state, citizens, and international players, and how they create elite bargains or indeed undermine elite bargains through their interactions. That's a very short version of that report. I encourage all of you to look at it. I'll put the link in the chat. Thanks.
Спасибо большое, Рено.
Thank you very much, Reno. In this session, we are having a famous Russian expert in trade policy, Andrei Spartak, the corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Andrei, do you have a 2-3 minute comment? Thank you very much. The discussion is very topical, very relevant. Unfortunately, in the recent years, one has seen deviations of the real trade policy, foreign economic policy from theory predictions is becoming a general rule rather than exception. In my view, this is happening because development of globalization has accelerated. We've seen the emergence of new qualitative features of that process. Everything is set in motion, and new technologies have qualitatively transformed the world of ours, and we see a wide spectrum of interests now emerging which were not there in place or not reveal themselves. Quite often they are group-based. We see a pluralistic development of the world at large and specific nations and societies. And we see this phenomenon where a strong real policy deviates from what the theory predicts or recommends. This applies to classical protectionism that today, unlike what we had before, has become very politicized and ideological, electoral. In the past, it was less visible, much less visible, and this amidst this fast and serious changes, that becomes visible and clear. This also applies to the fact that some types of protectionism become extraterritorial. Countries that adopt modern, needed legislation, but aim at solution of their economic issues and problems. These solutions might be quite progressive, but not acceptable to all the countries, and that creates a dissonance of sorts, which in the past, in coordinated was not a fact in the past. I think the questions and matters, issues under discussion today are very relevant for today. we need to find answers how, in this period of systemic transformations in the world economy and trade, countries taking decisions and making decisions which often are in disagreement with economic theory, together and separately could move forward. And economists' professional discussions are very important too. Thank you very much. If we could ask Natalia Volchkova, Deputy Director for Research of the Russian Academy of Foreign Trade, a very famous expert with a very strong academic background, but at the same time tending to make practical and pragmatic recommendations. Natalia? Thank you very much, dear colleagues. This idea of this club is very important. I hope to attend and take part. These topics are topics and issues we are facing now with democracy, in our theory, in our research. We are trying to implement using various tools, working with the government. A very interesting presentation, a very interesting comment. I'm in solidarity with all the questions and comments. And very much in consonance with our ideas. And we see that the gap between theory and implementation of practical economic policy is very much related to lobbying. Economic policy is extremely redistributive. Even small piece of policy is redistributive. Without redistribution, there would be no politics. Politics about redistribution, and economic political institutions are there to affect, and we see the influence of this redistributive effect. And the theory has been studying this. Myers, in 1984, showed that even ideal institutions where majority-based decisions are taken, decisions will differ from the first best because ownership is unevenly distributed. If there's even distribution of ownership, there will be no redistribution, there will be second best. Implement even first best in practice without relevant institutions restricting the influence of ownership is impossible. In trade theory, there are quite a few papers which are in consonance with the basic economic reality. Grossman and Keltman are very much about this. This is about theory and being implemented in practice. I would like to note other matters. The knowledge of theory by decision makers. That's a very important point. A very beautiful illustration, nice illustration of that is reference to the founder of market economy, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, using insights and intuition, not having today's apparatus of economic, using his intuition, built the basis of market economy, having made one mistake, where intuitively he applied the results of his analysis within a country, within national borders, to international economy. He made a mistake formulating the principle of absolute advantage. A small algebraic model was needed by the republic to understand where the mistake was made. Intuition alone is not enough for a good result. There should be knowledge of theory providing the result, how this principle of absolute advantage has arrived at. And this is important for this country, for other countries where no knowledge of formal theory, using intuition, employing a good and great background for individual decisions, people make mistakes. Here, the theory, it matters with the theoretical and theories check of performance results. And the last thing, the theory itself. One should realize that theory is not perfect. We do know many static outcomes, results of the way in statics the first best will be like. What is the first best in dynamics? We don't know. And real life decision makers in economy should take into account the dynamic. If in comparative statics we show that this equilibrium is better than that equilibrium, and we should move to the better equilibrium, providing better welfare. The question is how this dynamic transition will look like. When someone will be a loser, someone will benefit. We cannot calculate this dynamic transition stage. Very much depends upon the specific features of the real-life situation. One cannot calculate it and analyze it universally. It will look like differently in each specific country. In my view, it's a big gap in the current state of affairs in economic theory. It weakens the position of theory relative to the practice, and understanding what should be situation should be long term. We have little to say how this should be arrived at for the transition to be the first best. Therefore, no doubt, all these matters are critical. It's critical to discuss them and understand where we are in theory in strong positions and where we have gaps and limitations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting comment. And
Александру Владимировичу Данильцеву, директору Института торговой политики Высшей школы экономики.
Dr. Daniltsev, very much involved for a long time in foreign trade. Alexander, your comment. Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers, says Dr. Daniltsev, for the opportunity to take part in this interesting discussion. I want to thank Dr. Korkanen for a very interesting presentation, very instructive. A few comments, very brief. Number one, with regard to theory, number one, I think that one should see the theoretical foundation in wider terms. I will take issues. Ricardo's theory does not deny the Adam Smith. It's an extension, an addition in terms of foreign trade theory. I think we should take a broader view in choosing the theory. The second point.
I've got some concerns about what the economic experts are saying. And the question is whether we are using the theory well and in full, because every theory has certain restrictions on how to use them and under what conditions. And every time we test ourselves and check whether we are estimating our capabilities properly, or whether this theory does apply to this particular case. As for international trade, a lot of interesting things have been said already about the restrictions and the limitations that have impact on real policy and make it deviate from the recommendations. But I think this is a very specific area related to international competition, very unique area. And if in policy we have different interests conflicting, the conflict becomes more complex and diverse. And of course, our counterparts are after a particular goal and objective. And I would not agree with what the first presenter said. Not sometimes solutions or policy decisions are different from theory. Almost always they are different. It's the result of a compromise, a very stiff one, a compromise between the competitors and not between the representatives of different branches of power that are actually after the same goal. It is obvious that our world is not optimal, and there are a lot of factors that are at play here and that need to be taken into account. Andrei has already spoken about some of the issues related to the technology dynamics, and the features of protectionism that has been mentioned here include the following. Well, is protectionism going away? Of course, trade is getting more liberal. It would be strange to deny this, but protectionism is simply changing its shape. And it is important to find an adequate policy fitting the time and place that would allow us to obtain the results that we're after. One more point. We're talking about welfare. And I would like to point out that we need to be confident whether we are selecting properly the parameters that we are giving our politicians to make their policy decisions, whether they're adequate. And the term welfare, based on my experience, since I work in the practical sphere, that doesn't work that way, because even in economic theory, this is something that some believe to be a conditional, a notional idea. So it's very important to know what kind of arguments we're using, how we talk to the politicians, and what arguments we use. There is no single opinion, and theory is imperfect. Examples have been given here. Let me give you another example that is quite illustrative. There is no uniform opinion by the experts of whether proper and strict protection of intellectual property rights is necessary. Is this an incentive for development, or is it something that is actually restricting development, let's say, in emerging countries? There is no ready answer to that. And for decision-making is about making choices in every particular case by politicians. And here's what I wanted to conclude with. It may sound a bit informal, but in my lectures, I use this approach. I would quote or cite or retell sayings that are assigned to Paracelsus, who once said, when asked, how do you determine which is a drug and which is not? He said, everything is a medicine and everything is a poison. And it's just the dosage that determines the difference between one and the other. Thank you very much. Thank you. And one more discussant who has joined us, definitely a top-notch professional in economic theory, Sergei Pekarsky, Dean of the Department of Economic Science at the Higher School of Economics. And I'm sure that he's going to say a few good words in favor of the theory. Hello, dear colleagues. On behalf of the organizer, I'd like to welcome everyone. And I would like to thank you for a very interesting, well-structured presentation. And hopefully the series of meetings will be as fruitful as this one. I would want to make just one comment regarding this common issue that we're discussing today. What I wanted to say is that indeed in economic theory, there are a lot of different opinions, theories, but also nuances. And whenever we talk about public debates with politicians that result in certain decisions, it's very important what arguments the sides are using. And in that sense, we do realize that, in general, the key arguments that theoreticians are making about involvement of the government in economics deal with the gaps in the economy, market failures. And the economists that have a superficial view of the economic theory do not understand quite well what is the nature of these market failures. And the theory is quite complex and goes beyond the 4 key reasons for market failures that are given in the market economy textbooks. And sometimes the explanations are overly simplified, which creates a skewed view of what is really needed from the state in a particular case, or what is not needed. As a macroeconomist, I'm not an expert in international trade, but I would use this argument. We all heard about the idea that the central bank in an economy should be independent. Nobody argues that. But when it comes to a discussion of monetary policy, people often forget that there cannot be a well-structured relationship between the government and the central bank. It is something that complicates the idea of an independent central bank. Who is it going to be independent from, and why is it independent, and so on. So this is just one of the examples I wanted to use. And there are a lot of cases indeed where economists know a lot, but not always are capable of explaining all of the nuances on the one hand or on the other hand of that kind, and explain them to those who are participating in the discussion and in making the decisions. Thank you very much. Many thanks, Sergey. And now I would like to give the floor to Ika for some closing remarks and comments. And after that, we're going to start wrapping it up, and I will make an announcement for our next meeting. Ika, please, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for all the comments and the discussion. I do think that the topics that I've touched upon and only touched upon are extremely complex, as the real world is, and I have a lot of sympathy for all the points that were raised. I'd just like to sort of briefly touch upon the issue that Professor Gilman raised on the what do we do if and when economists or other experts don't agree on certain set of policies. And obviously this is the case in a lot of discussions about economic policy. That is the fiscal policy, is it stance correct? Is the monetary policy stance correct? Are our monetary policy tools, instruments, are they the optimal ones? And so on. I mean, this is these issues have been and will be debated for a long time. I guess the only answer is that there has to be a lively debate both within countries and globally about various issues, and hopefully through that discussion we can get at least somewhat more evidence on what should be done and what is the likely future course of economy. I mean, people in early 2000s, or sorry, about 10 years ago, when various central banks were sort of first using, say, different quantitative easing methods, a lot of people were worrying about inflation. Well, inflation didn't take off then. Now things are further complicated by the pandemic, and then I guess we just have to look at the evidence from various markets and sectors really carefully, and trying to think what are the most likely outcomes, and of course that is the job of central bankers, other policymakers every day. But I do share the worry that people in institutions, any institution, can fall into trap of sort of groupthink. And this is something that I think any good manager or leader of an institution should be aware and try to think of ways to bring in other views on the topic. I guess I'll close here, and thanks for all the comments.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, please allow me to extend my special appreciation to our first speaker of our club. I would like to separately thank Vladimir Sokolov, who invited and really incentivized ICA to take part in this discussion of our club, and to all of the participants of our discussion who spoke, and of course to the organizers here at the Higher School of Economics, without whom it would not have been possible to organize this meeting of the club. The question I have for Yaroslav Kuzminov, the research and academic director of the High School of Economics, maybe you have some closing comments, and then I will make an announcement about the next upcoming meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues. I was observing this discussion with a lot of interest. I think it indicates that there are a lot of opportunities, strong opportunities for restarting these serious discussions on the international level that bring together economists in Russia and from abroad. It was properly said that economic policy is always about reallocation or redistribution. And in economic policy, there's always a moment when the state doesn't have enough resources and not enough strength to redistribute wealth. However, certain redistribution is inevitable. It will be happening at all times. And optimal decisions from the standpoint of economic policy will never be reached. That's something that we have been reminded of. This is an obvious thing for any economist worth his salt. What are the conclusions that we need to make based on this? It seems to me that economists taking advantage of the fact that in addition to those who are responsible for security and defense are being listened to more than anyone else, are a little bit self-contained. And although we understand everything that we have been discussing here today, we sometimes, detach ourselves from the understanding that optimalities that we are looking at may not be the only optimalities that are out there. And just recently, we discussed with the cabinet headed by Mr. Mishustin, discussing the so-called total strategy in developing our country, in developing our development strategy, looking at assessment of effectiveness of different initiatives. And what we arrived at is that, yes, indeed, we have been observing economic growth. There is also the matter of fair distribution of welfare, but there are other criteria as well, such as political and social stability of the society, which does not always coincide with the arrival of welfare. And it's also the national sovereignty, an absolutely real thing for any policy of governments, be that here or in the European Union or elsewhere. This is a global position of the state or a group of states from where this economist is coming from. It's about preserving a nation's position at the edge of technological development, which is something that has become quite relevant for Russia recently. because nobody wants to be isolated technologically. And of course, over the recent years, starting with Greta Thunberg, another priority which is no less important than the others, or perhaps even more important, it's the ESG agenda, it's the environment protection, the protection of our nature. It has become the priority, sustainability of human existence. As you may understand, these are the things that people that are making decisions are relying on. And the very first two ones that I started with as an economist are not dominating ones, are not dominant. They are definitely in real governance practice are not dominating the discourse, and trade is happening not just in the presence of groups with different economic interests, special interest groups, but also taking into account that there are some players that put at the forefront some other interests, not economic ones in nature, non-economic goals. What are we going to do in this case, us as economists, because we are all economists gathering here? I think the economists need to learn how to talk to bearers of other understandings of societal development, other priorities of societal development, public development. We should not be saying that the environment is less important. We could probably explain that to them, but it's unlikely that after the explanation that has been provided would agree to scale back their efforts. What we do need to do is to show them the limits of what will happen once these interests are implemented, and the capabilities and opportunities that exist that would allow us to achieve certain global goals for the countries, our presence at the technology frontiers, and national sovereignty as expressed in its stability, and how this will ensure achieving more optimal economic state. This should be, I think, the key takeaway from this, or conclusion. I do not cherish the idea that this is overly regional, but for us, we need to face the question of whether we need to follow this logic that we have been discussing here. As I was looking at the discussion today, economic policy, applied economics, macroeconomics, or should we be seeking some intervention from bearers of other interests? And that will be a less traditional approach. Thank you. Many thanks.
The next session is to be held on the 11th of November with Alain Paquet, who worked in Quebec government as a finance minister in the Canadian Parliament. I think his presentation will be interesting from the perspective of the question that we asked today. Do we choose the right arguments in discussing these matters with decision makers? Are we right in the way we advocate and promote certain opportunities possible? Today, Alain is a professor of the University of Montreal. He's doing research. His topic is beyond the Ebony Tower, from academic economics to shaping of policy. I think we should expand the spectrum of attendees for this discussion to generate additional non-trivial perspectives. And I want to thank everybody who came in, and particularly because it's the first session, we'll appreciate it if you could respond and provide your reaction to this session at the HSE